Okay, if everybody could please make sure they're on mute, and we're just about to start. And just reminding everybody that although we love seeing everybody's faces, we are recording this session. So if you don't want to be seen on our recording, please turn your camera off now. To do that, just press the Stop Video tab on the bottom left of your Zoom screen. I'll just give you a moment for that. Thanks everyone for joining us this Tuesday for North Sydney's Independent Zoom Q&A. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Cammeraygal country on which we are fortunate to live. My name is Kristen Locke. North Sydney's Independent is a growing community group which is building a campaign with the aim of electing an independent for the federal seat of North Sydney at the next election. If you've attended one of our Zoom Q&As before, you'll know that I'm not the candidate, but am the spokesperson for North Sydney's Independent. I'm a local mother of two who grew up and went to school in Lane Cove and North Sydney, and have spent most of my working life in the North Sydney electorate. I became involved with North Sydney's Independent because of my kids, my nieces and my nephews. I want to ensure our next generations inherit a vibrant democracy with a government they can trust in a thriving Australia on a healthy planet Earth. North Sydney's Independent will be supporting a candidate from within our own community who represents our own community voices, rather than those of self-interested, perhaps political party power brokers and their lobbyists. This will be someone who sees the role as a service for their community. You can find out more about us via our website or follow us on Twitter, Instagram or Facebook. And please, if you don't already, subscribe to our weekly newsletter. This evening, we are pleased to be joined by climate experts Simon HolmesACourt and Nicki Hutley. Simon HolmesACourt is a senior advisor to the Climate and Energy College at Melbourne University. Simon sits on the board of the Smart Energy Council and the Australian Environmental Grant Makers Network. He writes regularly for The Guardian, and if you're not following Simon for his commentary, then please do so. We're also joined by Nicki Hutley. Nicki is a highly experienced economist and until recently was partner with Deloitte. Nicki is now an independent economist, commentator, and is a councillor for the Climate Council. Nicki is also a fellow North Sydney resident and voter. And before I just say a quick hi, if I can just make sure everyone has their screen on mute. That's that bottom left tab on your Zoom screen. Hi and welcome to you, Simon and Nicki.
Good evening.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Pleasure. Thank you, Simon. Some housekeeping before we begin though first, guys. We'll speak for the full hour, so I hope you have a nice cup of tea or wine in hand. I have my pucker tea. It's called Feel New. Do I look new?
You feel it.
Yeah, that's right. Again, we are recording everyone, so if you don't want to be seen, please turn your camera off. This is your last chance. So we did ask for questions prior to this evening, and if you have any more, please add them to the chat and we'll see if we can squash them into, although I doubt it. I think we're very full tonight. Simon and Nicki, are you ready?
Ready when you are.
Okay, let's begin straight off the blocks with a question from Kate from McMahon's Point for both of you. With the recent IPCC report bringing urgency to climate action, is net zero by 2050 enough? And I'll go to you, Nicki, first.
Sure, thanks, Kristen. And it's an excellent question. And I think not only the IPCC report, but in fact work that we did at the Climate Council several months ago, which updated some 2014 modelling from our own Climate Change Authority, which unfortunately doesn't have a great deal of authority and tends to get ignored by the government, but they're still sitting there producing a lot of work. And we looked at the carbon budget for Australia, for the world, and what we concluded from that, what we looked at the pathways, was that Australia basically needs to be have a 75% reduction by 2030 and full net zero by 2035 if we are to avoid the worst of climate damage. Now, that's a little bit faster than what we expect for the rest of the world, where we've got a 2040 target. But that's because Australia has the capacity, both in terms of natural resources and in terms of being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, in fact, the wealthiest per capita, to be able to make that adaptation even faster. And of course, it's not just about the cost, there's a whole lot of benefits that go with it. But the central point is 2050 is not enough. And I think you see that, Kristen, with the rhetoric that we're hearing in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow, as the climate leaders get together, that real sense of urgency is coming to the fore, hearing more and more criticism of Australia for not going fast enough. So we all need to move incredibly quickly. That's what the IPCC report is telling us. Must move very fast and in a grand scale.
Simon. Oh, you're on mute, Simon. Better turn that one.
Sorry, I should start by saying that I'm speaking from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung in the Central Highlands area of Victoria. Nicki's absolutely right. And to the basic question is net zero by 2050 enough? It never was enough to just say net zero by 2050. The question is, how do we get there? What's the trajectory? And there's if our emissions, if we look in the part of the economy that we control, not the land sector, but all of our energy sector, our emissions have been slowly increasing over recent years. Now we have to turn the corner, and we can either reduce quickly, or if we reduce slowly and did all of our reductions in 2049, we could end up both scenarios at net zero by 2050. But what matters is the area that's under that graph. And in order to meet the carbon budget that Australia can morally, ethically, scientifically emit, in order to meet that budget, we do have to have very steep reductions over this decade. We've lost the last decade where we could have been making reductions. We in fact increased many emissions in almost every sector, but we need to have steep reductions in this decade and work our way down to practically zero well before 2050.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that we can't just suddenly drop just before 2050. It's now that matters. Yeah. Next question from Susie for Simon. The government keeps trying to justify gas as a transition fuel on the basis that it's needed for peak times when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. Can you help us understand the facts? So do we have sufficient existing non-renewable energy sources to provide secure energy supply until battery storage, hydro, hydrogen and other clean energy sources are able to stabilise supply? Simon.
Yeah, it's a good question. And one of the reasons why this is such a contested space is the answer is not super simple. But I'll give you a simple, I can give you a simple enough answer. Gas plays a very important role in balancing our grid currently, but a very small role. In New South Wales, gas only delivers 1.5% of the energy in the grid. When it comes on, in the current generation mix, it is absolutely needed, but that's a tiny amount of gas. 80% of Australia's gas is exported overseas. There's plenty of gas that can be liberated from through electrification of homes and businesses. We have no shortage of gas. We have no need to exploit new gas fields. We as I said before, 80% of our gas is exported. So gas is now the transition bit. Actually, we're transitioning out of gas. Gas competes, there's new competition for gas. Pumped hydro, snowy hydro 2.0 is due to come online in about 4 years' time, and batteries are now starting to eat away at the market that gas had. So gas is 1.5 of New South Wales energy right now. It will fall from there. So no, we don't need more gas. And is it a transition fuel? Well, we're transitioning out of gas.
That is tiny. I had no idea.
It's tiny. It's tiny. The whole fuss about the gas-led transition is all about opening new gas fields to increase exports of gas. It's not for the domestic market. It's never been about the domestic market.
Mm. Oh, wow. That's just a massive point. And this is a big question from Mitch from Chatswood for both of you. Why is Australia such a laggard in addressing climate change? Are there structural roadblocks that we have? Nicki first.
No, there are no structural roadblocks. There are only political roadblocks. And, the more and more we see not only the science, but the economics giving really strong reasons as to why we should not act now. It's not just about avoiding the costs of climate change that are embedded at current levels of global emissions on the current pathways, but it's also about the opportunity for new industry, new investment. We just are sitting here with a small number of ideologues holding the entire nation to ransom effectively. There is no reason why we shouldn't be moving, why we shouldn't have seen Zali's bill, for example, accepted and be moving on the path, have a net zero target for the federal level. Look at what all the states and territory governments are doing. Look at what even local government is doing in this space. Everybody's moving ahead, business as well. Individuals are doing it. The only one that's not is the federal government. And you tell me, why can everybody else be starting down this and yet the federal government stands in the way? It is ideology, pure and simple, unfortunately, and we need to stop that as soon as possible.
Would you agree, Simon?
Yeah, Nicki's absolutely right. It's an ideological block. When you've got every state and territory of all political stripes, you've got the Business Council at one end and the National Farmers Federation at the other, all support this target that Morrison is just not able to commit to. And I think we've got to be frank. He's not able to commit to because the National Party won't allow him to, and the National Party and a significant part of the Liberal Party is in the clutches of the fossil fuel industry that do not want this transition because it spells the end of their industry. So it's structural only in the way that we have arranged our democracy, where vested interests have a lock on our political system.
Yeah.
There's our government goes on about the need for technology investment. We already have technologies to deal with more than 80% of our emissions. And we have good ideas how we can deal with the rest of it. We don't need to wait for development of technology. It's purely a delaying tactic. The real task now is to deploy, and our government is showing no interest in setting the conditions in place to allow that to happen.
So there's a roadblock and it's structural, but it's political. It's a political structural.
It's structural of our making.
Yeah. Anne from Neutral Bay asks, what can we expect the government to actually do for COP26? And as a follow-up to Anne's question, this might sound cynical, what greenwashing tactics might be used around COP26 that we should perhaps be savvy to? Simon, keep going.
I really wouldn't be surprised if Morrison does announce some kind of net zero by 2050. He'll probably say, exclude the gas sector and the agriculture sector, and have a number of exclusions and push. Maybe he'll announce a 2040 target rather than a revised 2030 target. But he'll play around with numbers and he'll gaslight Australia as they have continuously done. You often hear the Prime Minister saying, we've reduced emissions 20% and we're one of the leaders in the world. It's creative accounting that lets him do that. And if we look at I'll say every ranking system, every scorecard made by independent analysts, whether they're Australian or international, show Australia right down the bottom, often very last. So, expect Morrison to say something that's as meaningless. He announced the climate solutions package before the 2019 election, and nothing came of it. There's nothing new in that package that's been delivered. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see an empty set of announcements, as I think we've all become used to.
And Nicki, what kind of greenwashing are you expecting? You've been around a few years on this one.
It's puzzling to me that we are in the lead up to such an important event where really there's an expectation, certainly from the G7 leadership, that important announcements will be made, that there will be a shift on the Paris targets that will firm up the commitments for 2030, that we are hearing nothing from the government. There is no discussion with industry. I know that several leading industry bodies have said, peak groups have said the government has not approached them to ask them what their opinion is. There is nothing out there. It's all very secret squirrel. But I guess I might differ slightly from Simon's view, because I think whilst they want to do the least that they can, and whilst they will try and get away with the greenwashing, I think they're going to be under tremendous pressure from other countries. And we've already seen Morrison being called out by Biden and Boris Johnson on our lack of action. So I think the pressure is going to ramp up and be really, really strong. We hear, as Simon's just said, this, we'll meet our targets at a clip. Well, no, we won't. And our targets are not good enough anyway. There's a whole load of problems here. It's a question of what they think they can get away with, given the political pressure that they get from managing the global side of things versus what they're getting from, the Nationals and others on the right of the Liberal Party and of course the fossil fuel lobby groups.
So where are they getting their information from, Nicki? If they're not talking to the expert, who's writing this presentation that we're taking to Glasgow?
Look, I don't know, because it's because there is nothing out there, but I would hazard a guess it's being written in the Prime Minister's office rather than in the bureaucracy where the experts are. I suspect.
Yeah, we've seen that again and again, that the documents, well, really the Climate Change Authority was convened in order to provide expert advice to the government, and we saw this with Australia's Paris commitment in 2015. The Climate Council, so the Climate Change Authority put forward a suggested set of targets. Australia ignored that. Our federal government ignored that completely. They took the US's target and added 5 years. So that 26 to 28% by 2030 is just modelled on the US at the time, which was the same to 2025. We just gave ourselves an extra 5 years to do it. Remember this, when we keep hearing that Australia is going to meet its 2030 target, it's Tony Abbott's target. It's the one that he took to Paris, or he sent in advance to Paris. It was never sufficient, and the shameful thing is we're actually not on target to meet it at the moment.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's me a little bit cross. Now, Jenny from Chatswood, this is a really pragmatic, sort of practical question. I like this one. Are EVs actually a net sum gain for the environment in terms of carbon emissions, or once you take into account their lifetime carbon footprint, their production and the battery, and compare that with an ICE vehicle, do EVs, do they use more carbon? Are they a better environmental choice or not? Nicki, can I start with you on that one?
Yeah, this is a perennial question. I think people just like to throw things into the mix to try and confuse people, like saying that you can't use an EV to tow your boat at the weekend. So this is a bit like the question that John Hewson got on the GST with the cake, for those of us old enough to remember that. It does depend. It's not a straightforward question. But put simply, for the average person who drives a reasonable distance, and it's around 67 kilometres on average a week, you will, over the lifetime, it will be more environmentally friendly. Certainly the carbon footprint is lower. Of course, it depends how you charge your vehicle. And if you were to use solar panels in your home, use a battery charger, in fact, there's now technology that's going to allow you to charge your home from your car. I mean, there's all sorts of positive things that we can be doing. By and large, the answer is yes, it's fine. Possibly where there are some more worries is around the batteries and where they come from. Critical minerals, of course, cobalt is often used, which has modern slavery implications. Now, all of that Australia is rich in. We have the resources that are being developed, and so we can make sure that we have environmentally and in terms of modern slavery, sustainable supply chains in the future. There's huge amounts of research and pilot programs going on for recycling of batteries. They may even be able to be used. There's an MIT study at the moment showing that they can possibly be recycled into actual battery storage in the main grid system, repurposing the materials. So look, if you can charge from solar and make sure that your home, I mean, all of us now have the opportunity to connect our homes. You don't have to have solar panels on your roof to have renewable energy coming into your home. You can choose to provide, to have a renewable energy provider. And the more of us that choose that option, the more we force our providers to invest more in renewables. So if you've got renewables in your home, particularly if you've got battery storage, there's no reason why you aren't giving a massive net benefit over the life of your vehicle.
And isn't there also, don't EVs also have a very low maintenance requirement?
So yeah, they're much more efficient. So you have far less maintenance, and you know your overall running costs are. But that comes more down to running costs rather than your carbon footprint, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Look, I think it's I think we can actually be less defensive about EVs now. So the carbon emissions involved in making the batteries has plummeted in the last 4 or 5 years. Companies such as Tesla have really worked on how to reduce the energy input to make their batteries. And given that energy is a cost, they're not doing it just out of the goodness of their hearts. They're incentivized to reduce the emissions to make their batteries. Did some analysis recently that showed that only Victoria is the only place in Australia where charging using grid power might be more fuel emitting than using petrol, and that changes. The grid is getting cleaner every year, and the crossover point where electricity becomes grid power becomes cleaner, just normal grid power, not green power. But the crossover point is in this financial year. The great thing about driving an EV, plugging into the grid, is your car gets cleaner every year, rather than a petrol car, which might become less efficient towards its end of the life. EVs in Australia are becoming cleaner every year. So that idea that powering from coal-based grid, that's an argument from the past. We already, around the country, your lifetime emissions from an EV will be lower. We're already at that point.
I wonder if this goes back to how long term your view is. So sometimes you might think, well, in 3 years or 5 years, I'm not going to get an economic return or an environmental return, but we really need to be pushing our view out further. So we're not measuring in 2 or 5 or even 10 years, but 20 years. And this comes back to, we're doing this for our kids. What's happening in 2040?
A really sneaky thing was, the energy minister was tasked with putting together an EV strategy. And by the time it worked its way through the department and bounced back and forth between the department and his office, it came out being called the Future Fuel Strategy, or FFS, which is an amusing acronym for a paper. And it was a crazy paper. First thing, there was a recommendation from the department that new build apartment blocks and office blocks in Australia should have charging or pre-wiring for chargers in the basement. That ultimately people are going to want to charge their cars in the basement. The minister's office struck that out of the future fuel strategy, and they also spent they went to the effort to change the advice, saying that EVs are a waste of money and dirtier than petrol cars. What they did is they assumed that EVs had a 5-year life, and they assumed that they were charging from the dirtiest grid in Australia. It was a really, really poor piece of propaganda coming out there. But if you can afford a car, and this is the real objection to EVs at the moment is that they're too expensive. They are currently beyond the reach of a lot of Australians. If you do look at the life cycle cost, the full total cost of ownership, we're actually at the crossover point right now where the lowest cost EV in Australia, the MG ZS EV, if you look at its life cycle, so its full lifetime cost, it's already cheaper than a Corolla, which is an equivalent vehicle. And there are other cars that are at that crossover point. But I fully admit that an EV is beyond the reach of most Australians financially. That will change 2 or 3 years, 2, 3, 4 years from now, that will change. But from an emissions point of view, if that's what we're trying to do, if someone's at the point of purchase of a vehicle, you buy a petrol vehicle, it'll be on the road for the next 15 years and it will pollute every one of those years. Whereas the EV, at some point you'll sell it to someone who'll sell it to someone else, and every year that car gets cleaner. So from an emissions point of view, we're already there.
So it gets
have a look at what the ACT government is doing, investing massively in infrastructure. And so they are putting in place, they were supposed to have it this year, it's been delayed a little bit, but they are changing the planning regulations so that new multi-units buildings, residential buildings and commercial buildings do have to provide for charging units. They're investing right across both the New South Wales as well as the ACT and Victoria are offering incentives for people to buy. So we're really ramping up, and it's important for us as Australians governments to show the rest of the world, the car manufacturers, that we're serious, because once we do that, then they're inclined to send more cars here and then the price comes down. So it is a bit chicken and egg, but I just saw an article today saying that sales have gone through the roof. It's still a very small percentage of the total, but they have been rising massively. So the incentives are working. It's good to see.
Yeah. When do you think we'll get, so if our market's so small and there are no incentives here, is that part of the problem as well? Like you say, Nicki, the chicken and the egg, because there are so few cars to choose from, and they take 6 months to come. It's such an inconvenience to go. You have to be quite committed at the moment to buy an EV.
Yeah, but that will change. It's like any new market, and that's why government intervention at the start to kickstart that market is exactly the right thing to do. To go to the ACT again, they have converted over their government fleet as far as possible. It's not fit for purpose for every vehicle, but they've even got an electric fire truck. They've got all sorts of different electric ambulances, and they're acting as a model for the rest of the community to try and then say, look, here you go, this is what it looks like, here's all the charging infrastructure, go for it. And I think people also are, range anxiety is a thing. People do worry how far, but most Australians in a survey, they estimate, or they rather underestimate how far they can go and how far they need to go on a charging. Most people can get through the day on a charge from home. So we'll get there. It's about getting the knowledge out there. And just growing that market bit by bit. And these things always, I love the Bill Gates saying, we always overestimate the amount of change that's going to be in the next 2 years, but underestimate what's going to come in the next 10 years. It may not happen that quickly, but suddenly it will be there.
Mm.
I had the privilege of writing an article on EVs in the ACT, back about March, I think. And got to speak to the department who was responsible for their EV transition. They worked out that if they moved their leasing from a 3-year standard government lease to a 4-year lease, the EVs were already in the money. They were already cheaper to own for the term of their lease than their ICE vehicles. And they went to their leasing company, SG Fleet, a massive leasing company. They went to them and said, we want to move to EVs. They set themselves a goal to move every vehicle that was practical to across to EVs in 3 years, over 3 years' time. They're halfway through that transition right now. And SG Fleet initially said, oh, no, you don't want to do that. No, you don't want to move to EVs. They're more expensive. We're going to charge, they had all sorts of objections. And the ACT government held their ground and said, no, we're going to do it. And if you don't do it, we'll find another leasing company. SG Fleet folded and worked with them in order to get the trial underway and to start this. And as a result, SG Fleet are now able to offer this service to the federal government, to Qantas, to a whole, I think Coca-Cola, a whole lot of major Australian companies and entities use SG Fleet. And so just that little bit of clever work by the ACT, that's where government intervention can really work, where they forced a roadblock out of, no pun intended, but they managed to clear a roadblock for the adoption of EVs such that it became normalized. And then the secondary benefit is in 2.5 years, there's going to be a whole stream of secondhand vehicles from out of the ACT government that will enter into the second-hand car market and will be very affordable for a larger portion of Australians. So getting the fleet purchases, and something I learned in that process, more than 50%, I think it's around 52% of vehicles in Australia are fleet purchases. So it's phenomenally large, which means that a large, get the corporates, get the fleet companies like SG Fleet to start making EVs available. And in 3 or 4 years, we have a very vibrant second-hand EV market.
Wow, that figure, I had no idea. I would have thought it would be 5–10%. Why do you think SG were reluctant in the beginning? The fear of change or the fear of cost?
Look, it's probably, I should probably apologise to SG Fleet that I'm singling them out. So I'll just talk about generally the fleet management business. Fleet management business in Australia has grown out of your salary packaging. The legacy of fringe benefit tax has made fleet purchasing a really big part of the Australian car market. And when you, the fleet managers, and this is a general statement, make a significant amount of money out of the fuel card that comes along with the vehicle, out of the maintenance contract that come with the vehicle. Now, there's no fuel card needed for an EV. There's the maintenance. I've got an EV, absolutely love it. I've done 50,000 kilometers, and I'm yet to have a service for it. Right? There's no service. I've had the brakes checked when it went in for there was a recall of some bit of flashing around, or some bit of rubber seal around one of the doors, and they checked the brakes. I'll do a safety check now and again, but there's literally been no maintenance. I'm sure at some point it will need some, but that's a revenue stream that the fleet companies don't get. So it took them a while to get their heads around that. I'm sure we'll see some of the fleet companies doing deals with some of the fast charging companies. And one thing I probably should mention, there are about 4 fast charging companies in Australia, and they all have zero emissions, renewable power contracts feeding their chargers. So when you plug in and charge from, whether it's ChargePoint or Tesla or ChargeFox, when you plug into their charging infrastructure, you're getting zero emissions power into your vehicle.
How many of those are scattered around Australia?
Interesting. There was an article today actually about a company that's about to install 3,000 of these around Australia. But how many are there? It's in the hundreds of for fast chargers, in the low hundreds. For what's called destination chargers, which will take a few hours to charge. We're in the thousands of options. There's website, it's PlugShare, which is an app that catalogs them all. There's a site called a Better Route Planner, which you tell it from A to B, and it gives you all your options of where you can charge along the way. But I've driven from Melbourne up to Noosa. Back down inland. I've driven to Adelaide and all around Victoria, through Gippsland, down from Eden, through Orbost to Sale, back to Melbourne. I've done all that in an EV. There's a bit of a black spot around Malakuta over in the east. Malakuta is pretty isolated as it is. It's a beautiful part of the world, but there was a motel there that had an EV charger, and for $10 they let me plug in for a couple of hours while I went and had breakfast. So it feels, maybe at the moment it feels like when our parents' generation might have driven across the Nullarbor, and you've got to think, where am I going to get my petrol? Maybe there's a little bit of an adventure when you go inland and when you go long distance, but there are people who have circumnavigated the whole country in an EV. Absolutely doable. There's an electric highway the whole way around. And add the 3,000 that are coming, and there's hundreds of others that are being installed. It's really it's funny. We have one petrol car in the house that's will be replaced as soon as that car gets sufficiently old. And the first bit of range anxiety I had this year was when the reserve light came on in the petrol car, and I forgot about that. I forgot that the car eventually has to take petrol, and I had to think, am I going to make it to the petrol station? So I have had range anxiety since I had an EV, but in the other car.
Yeah, because you forget to fill up. You forget that it's a job. Yeah.
I don't miss standing at the Bowser. You know, it turns out that you don't, when you stop having to stand there on a cold night when it's raining next to, and the wind's on you and you've got the smell of petrol on your face, you can get used to not doing that.
Yeah, that's quite an industry that would change, because there's also a lot of fast, cheap sugar sold at these places, which is a little interest of mine. So if you were to reduce, I mean, it's a real transition that we're looking at, isn't it, for the next decade or 15 years?
Yeah.
Imagine petrol stations kind of disappearing.
Yeah, but this transition, the car transition is going to happen pretty slowly, because cars, the average car in Australia is retired at about, I think, aged about 19 years when cars are scrapped. So, on aggressive transition plans, we'll have 50, 60, 70% of new cars being EVs by the end of this decade. I think I'm on the bullish side. I think that Nicki mentioned before, these transitions take longer to start than people think, but when they do start, they go really quickly. So I think we're going to be frustrated at the speed of change in the next 2, 3, 4 years, but somewhere around 2025, the adoption of EVs will be massive. But even if everyone if 100% of people start buying EVs in 2030, there's still a lot of petrol cars on the road in 2040. So don't feel too sorry for the petrol stations or fuel tax or things like that. That transition of the fleet, of the whole car fleet to electric, is going to take a long time. People often ask, how are we going to power it all? And it works out that on an aggressive schedule, we need to increase the amount of electricity in Australia by about 1% a year in order to power electric vehicles. So that's nothing. We've had periods in the 80s and 90s when we were growing our electricity grid much faster than that. EVs are not an issue to power from the grid.
Fascinating. Meredith from Camaray, she has a question. I love this question. Where are the opportunities? Because there's a lot of good news. Simon, first to you in the renewable space. Where are the opportunities for Australia?
Yeah, good question. So we have about the best renewable resource in the world. We wax lyrical in national poetry and song about boundless plains and sunburnt countries. Our boundless plains are windswept and they're sun drenched. Right, we have an amazing amount of resource and a phenomenal amount of land with very low population density. We can build renewables at a much lower cost than almost every developed nation. There are probably, there are some countries in the developing world that have also got great resources, and I'm sure some of them will get newfound wealth from that. But Australia is really well positioned to go hard and fast on capturing this low cost of energy and starting to export or use this for to our advantage. And there's ways that we can export this energy. There's 3 ways we can export it. One is as electrons, and there are serious proposals, one of them backed by Twiggy Forrest and Mike Cannon-Brookes, to export electricity through a cable connected to Singapore. It's I think about 3,500 kilometers long. It's the longest undersea cable, but 3 times longer than the longest in Europe, but is set to send solar power from the Northern Territory to power about 20% of Singapore by, I think, 2028 is their target date. So we can export electricity as electrons in cables. We can export it in molecules, and by that we can use our cheap electricity to make hydrogen. We've heard a lot of noise about hydrogen. I'm sure hydrogen does have an important role to play. I could go into that. We could have a whole other hour on that. It's not the savior. It's not the be all and everything, but it's an important opportunity for Australia that we can produce hydrogen at a lower cost than many other countries. So we can and we can export it either in hydrogen form, which is difficult, or ammonia is actually an easy way we can send we can send that energy overseas. And Japan has a significant program. Where they want to buy what's called green ammonia. from Australia to use in a number of industries. So that's one way we can use our energy advantage, is to send green molecules. And then the last one is processed goods. There's a bunch of goods like aluminium. People in the industry often say aluminium is just congealed energy. It takes a phenomenal amount of energy to make aluminium. So wherever energy is cheap, you can make aluminium at a competitive advantage. And Australia has that emerging competitive advantage. The same with processing lithium for batteries, for a lot of materials, steel. Yeah, we currently ship an extremely large amount of iron ore overseas, and we send a lot of coal overseas, what's called metallurgical coal, to turn that iron ore into steel. Now, rather than sending the iron ore and the coal for someone else to turn it back into steel and sell back to us or sell to others, we can turn that iron ore into green steel using renewable energy. Goes through a process using hydrogen as in the middle. But they're the three ways we can use our energy advantage. And there's a lot of work happening on all three of those fronts.
Nicki, what are the opportunities in the growing economic case to address climate change?
Well, I think Simon's highlighted most. I mean, clearly energy is the main sector, and then obviously manufacturing using clean energy will be an opportunity for Australia. We do have to get the cost structure right. It's not at the moment, and that's not just about the cost of clean green hydrogen, but also about our relative labour costs compared to other countries. There's a reason we don't manufacture a lot of things in Australia anymore, unfortunately, but we still do have a significant metals processing industry, and that can benefit significantly, particularly if Europe and other countries go ahead with carbon border taxes. We need to be investing in this, or we're going to be pinged for not investing in this. But in terms of other sectors, smaller impact, but things, across regenerative practices. We can be having urban farms. We can be doing much more in our built sector to make sure we have, investing in to discover new types of products for building materials, making our buildings far more environmentally friendly and less energy intensive. And I think, we've already covered the transport sector. That obviously is a big one. And again, there's opportunities. I think the New South Wales government has announced it's going to convert its public transport fleet over time. There is a global shortage of electric buses. The ACT government at the moment's been told that there's a 10-year waiting list to get their buses. Right. I know, it's crazy, and they're 4 times the cost. The New South Wales government has then said, right, well, let's start building our own. So they're organising to do some of that. So if we think about, and there are opportunities for us to bring on manufacturing back onshore in some of these sectors. Even I was reading something today around offshore wind, which is a lot more expensive and a very small part potentially, but there are some companies looking at the potential for offshore wind and whether we can make turbines here, both for onshore and offshore wind. So there's plenty of opportunity. And I think the final one that I'm really interested in is research and development education field. So we know education, Australia is a services-based economy. We can do a lot in this field. There's going to be huge amounts of research over the next 10 years, probably more intensive than we've ever seen. And that will continue well beyond the next decade, but it's critical. So we want to make sure we have the best people here doing the research, making sure we have all the regulatory practices in frameworks in place so that we can then commercialise those developments as they come on stream and make sure we don't lose them as we have so many in the past.
John, I don't know where John's from, actually. The Grattan Institute recently noted the gridlock in the major parties and how this could be loosened by adding more independence to the crossbench. Obviously what we're about. Nicki, I might start with you. What's your view? Do you have a view on the role of independents and what sort of role they could play getting us on track with climate change and the new economy and renewables?
Well, the fact that I'm here tonight, Kristen, tells you pretty much what I think about how important I think the independent movement is. I think it's absolutely critical because the Liberal national coalition is absolutely tied up in ideology. Labor seems to have a little bit more of an idea, but is terrified to go too far and do too much. And that means you're reliant on the minor parties and independents to do the right thing. We've seen how effective they can be in negotiating better outcomes in the past. And I think if you get some really good people on board, I think Zali's been an absolute breath of fresh air, as have others that we've seen in recent times. Cathy McGowan, for example. These people, if we get smart independents in who get climate, that is our best hope. In fact, I think it's our only hope, quite frankly, to get meaningful action on climate change, as well as a number of other issues that we'd like to see that have been held up, like a federal ICAC, for example, and perhaps greater gender equality. But we're not here to talk about those things. On climate, we have just seen successive governments stall since Tony Abbott. Unfortunately, we did have an emissions trading scheme here. We did have, even John Howard was in favour of an emissions trading scheme. We need to get back on track, and I can't see how this is going to happen any other way than through having independents on the crossbenches making it happen and forcing the government's hand. And maybe actually that would be Scott Morrison or whoever takes over as the next Prime Minister. Maybe that's their get out of jail free card, because they say, well, we just had to do it because we had to negotiate with the crossbenchers, and that's the way they sell it to their party. So, but I think either way, we've got to get on board with this. Otherwise, we'll be sitting here in 10 years and, all of us with kids, grandkids, we worry terribly about what the future looks like, and quite rightly.
Yeah, and it's not just the climate, it's the economy that's going to change, and our kids are going to miss out. It's like the economic renewables global revolution is happening. The train's leaving the station, we're just not even on it.
And it's not just the lost opportunities, the economic costs of not acting on climate. I mean, I don't want to get everybody scared and in a down mood here, because we hear about the opportunities. But, every piece of modelling, and there's more and more coming out almost by the week, just shows you, if you think the COVID disruption has been bad, this is what we have to look forward to on an average basis every single year within sort of 40 years' time. It is just astronomical. And most of the modelling projections are conservative. They'll need to be updated with the IPCC AR6 latest paper. The cost of carbon that's used in most modelling is way too low. And if you think, but even with those conservative estimates, we are facing a COVID-size crisis every year from around the sort of 2060s, 2070s. It is frightening. And this is no longer the never, never. This is our kids and our grandkids. We should be absolutely out there fighting tooth and nail for this stuff. We get change.
Simon, can I quote you from I think it was The Guardian today?
Save me remembering what I said. Go for it.
Yes, it could be scary. A pro-climate crossbench holding the balance of power is the shortest and surest path to ensuring that the next Parliament ends Australia's lost decade on climate change action and makes real inroads on restoring integrity to our political system. All else remaining equal, voting in just 3 more pro-climate independents at the next election would force either major party to deliver the change Australians want. So what role do you see independents taking, Simon?
Yeah, so thank you. I agree with everything that Nicki said. Independence, I see as the circuit breaker, the only circuit breaker we have to the current situation. Look, maybe Labor can win the next election. They need to win 8 seats to win outright. That's a lot from where they are right now. And it looked like they were going to win 8 last time in 2019. And that's just not a risk that I'm prepared to take. And even if they get into power, what we've seen in the past is both parties, or Labor especially, really had a test in 2010 to 13. Labor was at their best when they had to negotiate with a strong crossbench. The carbon price that was legislated during that period was excellently designed and was working very well at extremely low cost. But we have other legacies from that period, such I guess the Climate Council that Nicki sits on is a natural evolution of the Climate Commission, which was legislated by that Parliament. the ARENA, the Renewable Energy Agency, and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation all came from that era. When Labor or any party has to negotiate with crossbenchers, that's when Australian politics has been at its best. And especially if we want an integrity commission, National Integrity Commission with teeth, it's not going to come from the major parties. It's going to come because they're dragged kicking and screaming by a strong crossbench. Now we need to make sure that it's a good crossbench. We need people with the integrity and accountability, such as Cathy McGowan, who's on this call. But there's a lot, Cathy has set a great example. Helen Haynes has followed in her seat. Zali Steggall, Andrew Wilkie, and Rebecca Sharkey have all been very strong on integrity and climate. We need absolutely more of them in Parliament. To that end, actually today I announced what I've been working on for the last 6 months or so, which is an initiative called Climate 200, which is working to level the playing field. There are so many benefits of being an incumbent. You probably, I mean, firstly, there's the brand. Every very large part of Australia votes with the party logo that their parents did, and then the incumbents rather get a large printing allowance, which allows them to spam your mailbox with all sorts of government propaganda. In order for an independent to have a chance, they need to have infrastructure around them. They need to have fundraising. They need to have supporters on the ground. They need a group as powerful, as committed and growing as North Sydney's independent is. Climate 200's job is to help with the fundraising of that. And we put out a call today on Twitter, and I'm really pleased to say over 100 people in the last 5 hours made donations to Climate 200. And we're going to help. We, as was said before, only 3 independents. If we flip 3 blue seats to independents, have 3 more, say, 3 more Zalis or Helens, we wake up on the night after election in a different country. I just want you to visualize how different Australia would have been if Karen Phelps and another candidate like Karen or Zali or Helen had got up. We would be in a different country right now. And we often hear of these modern liberals, these sort of progressive liberals who apparently are fighting for us on climate change. But I want you to think of I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts on this. Your local member, Trent Zimmerman, was on the parliamentary committee that reviewed Zali's bill. And as one of, I think there were only about 7 people on that committee, Trent recommended that Zali's bill not even be debated in Parliament. He shut that bill down, right? So for everything he says about being committed and trying to drag the party, there are no receipts that show that he's actually done that. They're just words. So ask for the receipts. The other thing too is that Trent's voting record is identical to George Christensen or Barnaby Joyce or Craig Kelly. They vote on party lines. Doesn't matter whether someone in their heart of hearts really does want to support this. If they're constrained by the party, we're not going to get the change. So I don't know. I'm not patient enough to wait for the Liberal Party to reinvent itself over the next 30 years. I really want groups like North Sydney's Independent, Mackellar Rising, there's Voices of Wentworth, Voices of Kooyong. I really want Australians to get in and back these groups. So I hope in whatever way you can, that you support this independence movement. I don't think we've ever been in a position where Australians have sensed that possibility, and there's been greater support. There was some polling released in the Guardian today that showed that North Sydney, Mackellar, and Wentworth are all primed for independence. So please, for the sake of my kids, your grandkids, let's do this. Let's make the change at the coming federal election.
Absolutely, the timing is right. It feels absolutely right for the picking. Last question, a quick one. Well, maybe. If you were PM for a day, what would you do? Nicki, first.
Oh, what wouldn't I do? Just on climate change, I think the first thing is we have to, get rid of any new proposed investments in fossil fuels. So axing curry and the grants that are being currently given for exploration in Beetaloo. There's so much money goes into fossil fuels at the moment. If we then redirect that in towards investments in making sure that we have adequate renewables and storage to firm it up, then we're on the right path. That's the biggest thing. Making sure that we are transitioning our transport fleet, so continuing to invest in all that infrastructure we talked about earlier to support the transition, providing incentives as well to get that market off. I think we can provide a greater regulatory environment for the buildings, the station, what we call stationary energy, the building sector, whether it's homes or offices, to make sure that they are the most energy efficient. But if we did only one thing, just accelerating the transition of the grid is the most important thing we can do, the single most important thing and the biggest priority for us today. There are lots of things we can do at the margin, but that's one that's going to have the biggest impact. And I'd also say to everyone, I'd ban eating meat, 5-6 days a week. No, just kidding. It's all right. You can still have your meat.
Oh, that's a bit of a big call, Nicki.
But I had to get that in there. Sorry. No, it's all right. I drive my family mad with that.
I think regen farming, you can have good.
Well, there's really great research going on to the Asparagopsis weed to help cattle reduce their methane output. So look, again, it's that research and development arm. Let's get more money in there. And if we think, just final point, if we have a look at that, the spend through COVID recoveries, Australia has spent around 2% of its COVID recovery budget on green initiatives, of which some is gas. Canada's spent 80%. Average country spending around the OECD has been around 40 to 50%. So we are just way behind the 8 ball. We could have done so much more. And the time is now. Let's just switch it over.
Simon, PM.
Wow,
you've taken all my ideas, Nicki. So I would, I would hand over to Nicki. But before I do that, yes, very first thing I'd do, I'd send the Billawella family back home to Beetaloo. I would bring everyone who's on Manus and Nauru that we put there, bring them back to Australia, and give the department a deadline to process them. Else, give them citizenship. I would, but on the and a federal ICAC. But putting aside a long list of social and sort of democracy-related efforts on the energy front, yes, let's get rid of all of the subsidies to fossil fuel. Let's do what Germany did and get everyone in the room together for a coal commission, the unions, the politicians, the energy companies, the communities, and let's work out a shutdown plan of how we transition these. That's the largest emitting sector in the country, and then whether we go sector by sector to work out a transition plan to zero emissions, or whether we put in an economy-wide carbon price with other complementary measures. Not sure which of those two I'd do, but I would do it quickly. We had a system that worked, but we also know that small incentives on EVs can make all the difference in making people's purchasing decision to be the one that has a long-term benefit for the environment. So, apart from that long list, that's what I would do.
Full day. That would be a very full day for PM. Denise, we're so close to time. What's been going on in the chat? Are you there? Hello.
I am. Hi everyone. What an interesting conversation. I think people in the chat have been cheering on Nicki and Simon to be PM for a day, if not a little longer. So breaking news there, perhaps. It's been a really interesting chat and a really interesting discussion to listen into. Jennifer made the comment in the chat that if you haven't yet driven an EV, they are way more fun to drive. She's had hers for 18 months and will never go back to ICE. a lot of conversation in the chat about EVs, so that was a really welcome discussion. Simon Van Wyck, my old friend, says there are 18 Chinese brands we have never heard of about to launch EVs in Australia. That was really interesting. Steve, also very active in the chat. Offshore wind is much more cost effective than we imagine. Welcome to Kathy McGowan, who's also joining us in the Zoom room. And Peter made a comment that I absolutely agree with. Party members vote 99% for the party, not for constituents. They do not represent you. And again, that's really the theme of why we're here. Really interesting conversation. Thank you to the over 100 people who are in the Zoom room tonight. Really good of you to come. Please make sure that you subscribe to NSI's weekly newsletter in your inbox, 10 o'clock every Friday morning. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, we also now have a donation function on our website. We're so modern, so please consider donating if you believe in what we're doing. And a huge thank you to those who've already actually donated there just this week. Thank you so much. I sense a great support in the community. A lot of people very fed up, but also a lot of people excited to have a forum to make change in their electorate. So go North Sydney. Thanks. We'll be back again in coming weeks, first with more special guests, so keep an eye on our newsletter for those. Thanks so much again to Simon HolmesACourt and Nicki Hutley. We hope to see you all again next time. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks. Thank you.
Night.